Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the Symposium on Race, Human Rights, and Populism in Poland. My name is Jonathan Larson, and I'm the Associate Director of the European Union Center at the University of Illinois, as well as a scholar of things Central European. This event today is an exciting collaboration through the Jean Monnet in the U.S. initiative, promoting awareness of what the Erasmus Plus program of the European Commission does to support the study of Europe and the European Union at U.S. research universities. The University of Illinois European Union Center currently holds the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence grant. Today's symposium would not have been possible without two specific partners, the Center for European Studies at UNC Chapel Hill and the Institute of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies at UC Berkeley. Kathleen Lindner and Jeffrey Pennington, I'd like to thank both of you for your help putting this together. I would also like to thank the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Center at the University of Illinois for their assistance and promotion. And of course, UC staff, Sydney Lazarus, Irati Hurtado Ruiz, and Nick Zalewski for their great work. Our symposium will be moderated by George Casina, Associate Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures and Comparative and World Literature at the University of Illinois. Before Dr. Casina introduces our guests and opens a series of their short opening presentations, I would like to share with you some highlights of his background. Born in Łódź, Poland, and raised in Canada, Dr. Casina researches and teaches courses on Polish modernism, exilic and diasporic literature, and continental literary theory. He is the author of Polish, Hybrid, and Otherwise, Exilic Discourse in Joseph Conrad and Witold Gombrowicz, published in 2011, and editor for the volume Joseph Conrad's Polish Soul, Realms of Memory and Self, published in 2016. His articles have appeared in numerous journals and series, including Slavic Review, Canadian Slavonic Papers, the Polish Review, and Joseph Conrad, Eastern and Western Perspectives. He is currently completing a book on 20th and 21st century Polish provincial and borderland fiction. We are delighted that Dr. Casina can moderate our discussion on a topic that we think demands multiple disciplinary perspectives and historical sensibility to understand the dynamics in contemporary Poland that contribute to it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. George Casina.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Jonathan. And thank you for all the panels. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I will, in the interest of time, I will just introduce all the speakers in the order in which we'll be proceeding. So first, Professor Connolly, then Konstanty Gebert, Courtney Blackington, and then Professor Wachudova. So let me say a few words about the panelists, and then I'll let you guys take it away. So John Connolly is Sidney Hellman Urban Professor of History at the University of California at Berkeley and Director of the Institute for East European, Eurasian, and Slavic Studies. He is author of Captive University, The Sovietization of East German, Czech, and Polish Higher Education, From Enemy to Brother, The Revolution in Catholic Teaching on the Jews, and most recently, From Peoples to Nations, A History of Eastern Europe, which came out with Princeton just last year. So please welcome Professor Connolly. The next speaker perhaps needs no introduction, but I'll give one anyway, since I said I would. So Konstanty Gebert is an international reporter and columnist with the Gazeta Wyborcza, which is one of Poland's two leading dailies. He was democratic opposition activist in the 70s and underground journalist working with the pen name Dawid Warszawski during the 80s. He's co-founder, among other things, of the underground Jewish Flying University and of the Polish Jewish intellectual monthly Midrash. He has taught or lectured at such universities as Hebrew University, UC Berkeley, and Grinnell College. He is author of 11 books in Polish, and many of these have been translated into English, Italian, and Bosnian on such topics as Poland's roundtable negotiations of 1989, on Yugoslav wars, and on Jewish history. He is author most recently of Rachunek i Zguba, Rosyjska Szkoła Nowoczesności i Polityki dla Żydów Polskich. If you didn't catch all of that, it's Salvation and Perdition, the Polish Jews' Russian School of Modernity and Politics, which came out last year in Warsaw, and a piece post-face in Juifs en Pologne, quand la Pologne a cessé d'être une terre d'accueil, last year in Paris, which would be translated as Jews in Poland when Poland ceased to be a land of refuge. That came out last year. So please welcome Konstanty Gebert. Then our third speaker is Courtney Blackington. Courtney is a PhD student studying comparative politics and methodology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her dissertation explores how political socialization and personality traits shape protest participation in East Central Europe. More generally, her research focuses on conspiratorial beliefs, protest participation, and partisanship. She holds a MA in political science from Columbia University and University of North Carolina, and a BA in government from the College of William and Mary. So please welcome Courtney Blackington. And finally, last but not least, Professor Milada Anna Vahudova specializes in European integration and political change in post-communist Europe. Her recent articles explore the trajectories of European states amidst strengthening ethnopopulism and democratic backsliding, and how these changes are impacting the European Union. She is a Jean Monnet Chair and an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And her book, Europe Undivided, Democracy, Leverage, and Integration After Communism, which came out with Oxford University Press, was awarded the Stein-Rocken Prize for Comparative Social Science Research. So please welcome Professor Vahudova, and I will now let you guys take it away, starting with Professor Connolly.
So thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Delighted to be here virtually. What we've been reading in the past few weeks is one of those stories you would not believe unless you knew it were true. In order to protect Poland's good name, the Polish state has been persecuting historians and journalists, subjecting them to police interrogations and intimidation, and making many of them answer to libel charges for supposedly insulting long deceased subjects of their research. It's as if no one with a high school diploma, let alone PR credentials, had told the people at the pinnacle of Polish politics that such acts will make Poland's good name, if any country has such a thing, much more difficult to defend. That they will contribute to charges being made, to borrow vocabulary recently used by the US president in another context, that Poland is ruled by people with a Neanderthal mindset. For how else can one describe the impression made by sending a beat cop to quiz a journalist on whether or not she did mean to insult Poland? I want to make this absurd case perhaps more understandable by bringing to bear some historical context. First thing I want to note is that these events of recent weeks and months signal a break with what we knew and expected not that long ago. Until pretty recently, I'm thinking 5 or 6 years ago, one thought of Poland as a place featuring unimpeachable academic freedom. In fact, this reputation goes back further. Even under communism, Polish social sciences and liberal arts managed to be of European and even global stature because their freedoms were largely respected. If one goes beyond academia, from the 1970s at the latest, Poland was a front runner in the cause of promoting freedoms more generally, up to and through the events of 1989. One goes back even further, one sees this record of engagement for open society extends to the war years, when Poland produced a tenacious underground state opposed to Nazi occupation, a state which made everything from hand grenades to courts of justice, from newspapers and academic journals to avant-garde poems. So the weirdness of today's situation of de facto censorship of journalism and history consists in two things. First, it introduces a long history of resistance in Poland to censorship and state tyranny over the mind. But second, and this will sound confusing, the story that Polish courts and police are introducing academic freedom in order to uphold, according to which Poland was a society that did not collaborate with Nazi Germany, is precisely what historians, including myself, were saying not that long ago. In my lectures of the 1990s, I told students that Poland produced not only no Quisling, but this amazing cultural resistance that I've just mentioned, which was so widespread that it involved teachers and students risking their lives to hold underground classes in sociology, literature, and of course, history. Any collaboration with Nazism was thought to be exceptional, the province of lowlifes and criminals. So the current regime, paradoxically, is suppressing academic freedom, supposedly to protect the heroic story of an earlier generation that died for the sake of academic freedom, a story which until recently I myself was involved in telling. Then about 20 years ago came Jan Gross. showing in a book called Neighbors how in one small town in 1941, Poles had tortured then killed the Jewish population. It's hard to understate what a shock that was. I'm sorry, it's hard to overstate what a shock that was to Polish consciousness. But the revelation also had political consequences, dividing the left-right spectrum much more deeply than it was already divided, a bit like the Dreyfus affair, perhaps, and producing on the right a savage campaign of vituperation in which gross and everyone open to uncomfortable facts became an enemy. In the past decade, so beginning in about 2010, things have gotten worse for the guardians of Poland's good name. Newer research by Barbara Engelking, Jan Grabowski, and others has shown that the problem of Poles killing Jews was not limited to one small town. It extended across Polish territory and meant that virtually everywhere, but especially in the countryside where Jews sought shelter, there were Poles on the lookout to make sure they did not survive. This kind of Polish collaboration in the Holocaust was massive and not directly enforced or required by the German occupiers. According to a popular right-wing ideology, Jews were a foreign nation, and therefore individual Jews, though Polish citizens, were enemies. In his study of one district near Warsaw, Grabowski writes, the problem, and by the way, Grabowski is a recent subject of libel charges. The problem was not indifference. If Poles had only been indifferent, many more Jews would have survived. The problem was evil intent, the pervasive drive among Poles to identify Jews and hand them over to authorities, if not murder them themselves. So if a Jew survived, it was generally not because of the active assistance of his or her Polish neighbors, but rather because of happenstance, because of an absence of evil intent. This interpretation, of course, completely dispenses with the notion of Poland as a country without equivalent. Or does it? Despite everything that has come forth, it's still true that relatively speaking, there was much less collaboration in Poland than elsewhere. The underground was huge and there was no collaborator state. At the same time, the underground effectively stood by and let the Holocaust happen. And if a Jew was saved thanks to the protection of the Home Army, it was more than likely because he or she was not seen as a Jew. Maybe to conclude, some thoughts on where to go from here. The view that Jews were not part of the Polish people and thus not worthy of the effort to save them did not come from nowhere. It had origins in a movement called national democracy, or Indecja, and most directly in its founder, a man to this day considered one of Poland's political and intellectual heroes, the natural scientist Roman Dmowski, who co-founded what became Indecja in 1893. At the center of this movement was a conviction that there is a foreign people among us out to take our jobs and deny our natural desire and right to assert ourselves in the world. This people was the Jews. As a racist, Dmowski thought nations were organisms and Jews were a foreign organism on Poland's territory. Now, racism and anti-Semitism were not unusual in the Europe of Dmowski's time. What was unusual in Poland were two things. Racism and anti-Semitism were a central platform of this largest mainstream political party from the beginning. That is, from the constitution of Poland's political spectrum. I can think of two other cases in Europe like that. And second, that we have in today's Poland, and this is unique, I believe, a party that identifies and defends the heritage of that party. Just look at the right-wing press. Dmowski is a kind of demigod, a Polish George Washington and more. But as always, when politics meets history, things are not simple. PiS, the party of law and justice, does not call itself Endek. And if its insistence on upholding Poland's good name is so shrill and tactless, it's because, unlike their much admired Dmowski, they could not afford openly to be pure racists. So they mix their own heritage of ethnic exclusivism with a different Polish heritage, an older one, represented more by Dmowski's rival, Józef Piłsudski, of Poland being about shared culture and devotion to freedom. It was this conviction and this tradition, I would argue, that produced that underground flowering of dissent, and even the occasional willingness to accept Jews into the Home Army. It's this mixing of heritages by PiS that creates the crazy contradictions I mentioned at the outset. A final complication before I close. What about the defenders today of that other Poland, the cultural and political Poland? Where are they now? It seems as far as Dmowski and his heritage are concerned, they are divided. There are those who want to rename public places, for example, one of Warsaw's busiest crossroads, Rondo de Mosquego. They want to call it the Rondo of women's rights. But there are others, many of them, on the center and left who say absolutely not. Okay, we know about Dmowski's anti-Semitism, they say, but Dmowski did so much for the Polish cause, for example, at Versailles, that we must honor him. One of these voices, I was astounded to learn, belongs to Monika Jaruzelska, daughter of the general. My sense is that here is another myth, ready for demolition. No matter how many extra square miles of territory in Poznania or the Baltic coast Roman Dmowski may or may not have gained in 1919, it does not counterbalance his production and authorization of the cool hatred that a generation later cost Poland the lives of the great majority of its Jewish citizens who had managed to escape the Nazi occupiers. So one final word, and pardon me if this sounds moralizing, but maybe it's appropriate to the topic. Before Poland can proceed into a future fit for a modern European country, it has to disavow this racist legacy. Germany once had denazification. I think what Poland needs is de-endekification, if that's a word. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Connolly. We will have the Q&A answer at the end, and there are places you can ask your questions on the bottom of your Zoom if you're on the regular kind of Zoom Q&A section, and we'll read them in the order that we receive them. So now I'd like to give the floor to Konstanty Gebert. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for organizing the symposium. John, if you think about the de-endekization, you'll have to be very, very patient. Remember the quote from Czesław Miłosz that the Polish soul is naturally endek. It's a play on the words on the Catholic statement that the human soul is naturally Christian. And there is a grain of poisoned truth to that statement. And that grain of truth is possibly one of the reasons why we didn't see it coming. You're absolutely right. Some 10 years ago, Poland seemed to be everybody's poster boy, right? We were top of the class in everything and moving ahead at vertiginous speed. If you look at anti-Semitism, which is what I'd like to focus on, you could see all the sociological polls showing anti-Semitism in decline, anti-Semitism growing. You could actually extrapolate from those polls and identify the moment in the future when anti-Semitism will have disappeared from Poland once and for all. And then new polls started showing up. By the early 2010s, polls by Professor Michał Bilewicz started showing an increase in anti-Semitic attitudes. The number of Poles who believed in the myth of ritual murder doubled from 12 to 25%. Same the number of Poles who believe that Jews living today are responsible for the murder of God. The percentage of those who believe that Jews aspire to world domination grew to 44%. All this preceded the electoral victory of law and order, of peace in 2015. It would be a mistake to attribute what happened after 2015 solely to the fact that peace won the elections. Peace won the elections because of changes in public opinion that preceded 2015. And they can be well understood, I think, through the prism of the Jewish issue, although the issue in itself is not the determinant force, but it helps focus all the different strains of intellectual and political reflection. What happened after Jan Gross' neighbors, as you rightly pointed out, was a moral earthquake. Gross forced us to confront ourselves with an image of Poland we never really saw. We were the nation of heroes and victims, not the nation of murderers and perpetrators. We all grew up in this belief. When I first came to Jedwabne in '75, by chance, hitchhiking across the country, I walked around. It's a very sweet little town, and eventually asked the passerby, where is the main road off to Łomża? The gentleman was slightly drunk, but he managed to explain that I should go right next to the place where they burned the kikes. Beg your pardon? Yeah, the place where they burned the kikes. And there was something in the way he said that made me ask, you mean the Germans did? He said, nah, what Germans? Our guys. What do you mean, our guys? Well, the father of that woman over there walking, and the guy who lives here. And I left Jedwabne and completely forgot that conversation. I had nowhere in my mind a place for it. This was not only not the Poland that I knew, but it wasn't an imaginable Poland. It came back only after the first debate on Jedwabne in the Jewish Historical Institute in the heady days of 1981. But much as we being the liberals, Europeans, Democrats, whatever, had by the 21st century believed that all this is behind us, a lot of Poles disagreed. A lot of Poles believed that they had their past stolen from them and they wanted back. One of the main electoral arguments that PiS made in the campaign of 2015 is that the liberals in power had fed the Poles, quote, a pedagogy of shame, which is completely false. And what Poland needs is to rise from its knees and stand tall once again. Make Poland great again. It worked. People believe that PiS can actually deliver a better past than we had, the past that we deserve, the past that truly represents us, and not the Jewish lies that we've been fed. And therefore, you had a series of government actions that the government calls its historical policy, with the objective of rectifying the past. The libel trial against Grabowski and Engelking is just the last step of a long process that starts with the infamous quote-unquote Holocaust law of 2 years ago that would make it a criminal offense to say that the Polish nation, capitalized of course, was responsible for secret police. But to return to the quote-unquote Holocaust law, in my column, I broke the law, and I ended the column by calling the attention of the public prosecutors to that fact. Nothing happened. So I started calling prosecutors I know and telling them, guys, I just broke the law. Would you perhaps express some interest? And I got answers from them with anatomically improbable suggestions about where I can put my law breaking. But nobody was interested in prosecuting me, of course. It's the narcissism of intellectuals who believe that punitive laws are about them. This wasn't about us. This was about the provincial school teacher who learned from that law what he's supposed not to teach about. For the reporter in the local paper who understood that digging up reports about what happened there in 1943 will not serve his career. And it worked. The freezing effect is already there. I know of people who changed the subjects of their master's thesis to get away from the Jews in order not to have a hard time later. In the meantime, the government went on a charm offensive, explaining how wonderful Poland always was for the Jews. Our president said that Poland had at least 300,000 righteous. Yad Vashem evidences 7,500, and it's the biggest group from any country, but not good enough for the president. Our prime minister said that each and every of the 300,000 Polish Jews who survived only because they had met Poles who helped them. Blissfully ignorant of the fact that 250,000 of those 300,000 survived in the Soviet Union, where they didn't need to beat Poles to survive, and of the 50,000 who survived under German occupation, the single biggest group were those who managed to survive in a German labor camp, where they were absolutely safer than trying to hide in the Polish countryside. But the image that the government is projecting is of a selfless nation helping Jews at the risk of their lives. According to the government, only in Poland was there a Nazi law punishing with death any help given to Jews, whereas it was a frequent Nazi legislative instrument that obtained also in the Ukraine, in Belarus, in the Baltic states, in Norway, in Serbia. But here we had this noble and selfless Polish nation. And what is the Jewish response? Not only they deny us our 300,000 righteous Gentiles and want us to accept those crumbs of 7,500, but they actually demand from Poland war reparations. This, of course, a reference to attempts by Jewish organizations to have Poland pass a law on the restitution of surviving Jewish property. Nobody demands, obviously, war reparations from Poland. Poland was not responsible for the war. But if property survived, the fact that somebody is Jewish should not be a reason for not being able to restitute it. In fact, it's very difficult to get any property restituted in Poland today. But for the descendants of Jewish survivors who mainly live abroad, it's next to impossible. So in a nutshell, Poles tripped over each other to save Jews during the war, regardless of the fact that only in Poland there was a death penalty for it. And in response, the Jews refused to recognize Polish heroism, slandered Poland by accusing Poles of participating in the Shoah, and tried to extort money from Poland, demanding reparations for what the Germans did. Now, if all this is true, Jews are genuinely horrible people. And it's not surprising that 2 years ago you had a demonstration in Warsaw with about 12,000 participants under the slogan of "The Jews are the hyenas of the Holocaust," preying on the dead bodies. Now, why does the government need that? It's not that they're stupid or ignorant, although our former Minister of Education did say that she doesn't know who killed people in Jedwabne. It's still a mystery. But by and large, everybody knows the score, so why? Well, because if the government can give us a better past and protect us from Jewish slander and extortion, that's a very powerful reason to vote for the government. And in fact, there is a not negligible segment of Polish public opinion that very actively supports the government in this endeavor. 39% agree. This was a poll made after the slander case against Grabowski and Engelking. 39% agree that historians should be prosecuted for painting Poland in an unfavorable light. This is the way it was phrased in the poll, and this was what garnered 39% approval. Not even unfairly depicting Poland in an unfavorable light. If the image is negative, they should be punished for it. If so, it's really not surprising that 20% of those polled agreed with the statement that while what happened to the Jews in World War II is regrettable, it's a good thing we no longer have Jews in Poland. Now, all this, of course, is hardly about the Jews. We are a tiny community. The organized Jewish community is 8,000 strong nationwide in a nation of 38 million. And although a large number of polls agree that we do have too much influence, that influence, in fact, we would be very happy if it were negligible. It simply doesn't exist. Yet, the Jewish issue is like a litmus test. If you're taking a train and there's somebody else in the compartment, well, you know you'll end up talking politics, so you might just as well sound the other person out to find out where he or she stands. You can start by asking them a cafeteria of questions about this or that, or you can ask them, so what do you think about the Jews? If the person is anti-Semitic, it's highly probable that he or she will also be anti-democratic, anti-European, nationalist, Catholic fundamentalist, misogynist, homophobic, the works. And if that person declares himself or herself to be anti-Semitic, then it's highly probable that that person will be a Democrat, pro-European, anti-authoritarian, anti-misogynist, tolerant towards others, etc. So at the end of the day, it's obviously not about the Jews. It's about the kind of Poland we want to have. If we want to have a better past, a past that depicts us as noble heroes who never harmed a fly, this comes in a package deal with a better Poland, which is nationalist, Catholic, authoritarian, as little as European as it can allow itself to be. On the other hand, 85% of the Poles believe that joining the EU was a huge success, and we desperately want to remain in the EU. We just don't want the EU interfering with us. For all of this, the Jews are a stand-in. And this, in fact, is not a conflict between Poles and Jews. It's an internal Polish conflict. And much of Polish public opinion is desperately against this government and its historical policies. One of the first academic bodies to condemn the verdict against Engelking and Grabowski was the Polish Academy of Sciences, that our current education minister wants to purge of damnable and sinful leftist influence. So there we are. As Karl Kraus famously said in the 30s, anti-Semitism is a disease of the Gentiles, which is fatal to the Jews. Turns out it's fatal to its carriers as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constante. Thanks so much. Our next speaker, you can hear me, is Courtney Blackington. So please go ahead. If you're sharing your screen, you may want to do it before you start speaking.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me to present on this symposium. Today, I am going to speak about the flip side, some of my research on who protests in defense of liberal democracy in Poland. I will start by providing a bit of context about some of the protests that emerged in late 2015 against peace reforms. Then I will talk about how political socialization under the communist regime seemed to play a role in driving this early wave of protest in defense of liberal democratic institutions. I will argue that political socialization under non-democratic institutions may encourage a generation to mobilize in defense of liberal democratic institutions, norms, and values decades later. And I'll conclude by discussing how political socialization in communist times shapes the degree to which different generational cohorts participate in the current wave of protests in support of women's rights. And so initially, after peace was elected in the fall of 2015, really focused on attacking liberal democratic institutions. And as peace undermined judicial independence with a series of reforms beginning in 2015, several groups began to organize protests to defend liberal democratic institutions. And indeed, if we look at this data from VDEM, which measures the frequency and size of mass mobilizations for pro-democratic aims, we can see that since 2015, there's been a rise in mobilization for democratic institutions like independent courts, as well as in support of civil liberties like freedom of association and speech. So on this graph, where a 0 means virtually no protest events and a 4 means that there have been many large-scale and small-scale protest events, and we can see that Poland has experienced many protests in defense of liberal democratic institutions, norms, and values since the 2015 election. And when we pair this reality of an increasing protest sphere that's geared towards defending liberal democratic institutions and values, alongside data from the European Social Survey on general protest participation, we can see that while before 2015, individuals who were middle-aged or older protested at lower rates than younger people, by 2016 and thereafter, middle-aged and older people began protesting at higher rates. And in this graph, one is considered to belong to the older cohort if they were born in or before 1981, whereas younger people were born after 1981. I can justify this in the Q&A, but it really just has to do with communist socialization processes. So while many young people protest in general in Poland, what struck me as really surprising was the increasing involvement of middle-aged and older individuals in protests in Poland. If we look at the activist leadership of prominent protest groups in Poland, like Obywatele RP, Code, or Strajk Kobiet, a sizable proportion of activists in these groups, and particularly of leaders and organizers in these groups, are middle-aged or older. This is surprising because typically when we think about who protests, we assume it's these young people under 25 as particularly active participants. They may have the time or fewer constraints on their participation. But in this case, we can see that protests are really composed of a higher number of middle-aged and older people than we might normally expect to see at a protest. So part of my research agenda asks why, and kind of in particular, to what extent the memories of communism shape the willingness of the generations who were socialized under communist rule or during the transition to democracy to protest in defense of liberal democratic institutions decades later. And to answer these questions, I interviewed organizers of protests that defended liberal democratic institutions across 6 different towns and cities in Poland. And I also conducted an online survey of protesters. In my interviews, I asked participants to first describe how they became involved in protests. And after this, I simply asked what motivated them to protest initially. And surprisingly, I found that every interviewee that was over 40 referenced their experience living with authoritarian institutions or living during the transition to democracy as cornerstones to their decision to protest in defense of liberal democratic institutions almost 30 years later. So when I asked one middle-aged protester why she began protesting initially, she mentions her memory of communist times, how she spent her youth under communism, how the day of the transition was the most important day of her life. She knows what it's like when democracy is in danger. And so in response to the attacks on democratic institutions perpetuated by peace, she felt that it was natural to protest. And she says that this sort of sentiment may generalize to a sizable proportion of her generation because they know that this lack of freedom is realistic. A different protester in a different city who's older echoed her, saying our generation remembers the dictatorship. We know that we need to do something now. Another in a different city mentions that while it might not be clear how democracy dies for a lot of people, it's perhaps more visible to subsets of his generation because they lived without this freedom. And I think it's important to underscore that this is not simply kind of an anti-youth sentiment that's held among middle-aged and older people, but rather in my interviews, I found that this actually generalized to younger protesters as well and younger organizers as well. So when I asked younger organizers the same questions and kind of what they thought motivated other protest participants to protest, about 80% of my respondents that were under 40 noted that communism seemed to play a role in the decision of middle-aged and older generations to protest. So one young organizer said that the older generation had to fight for democracy in the past and they have this experience living under non-democratic states, so they are more likely to protest when peace changes the democratic institutions. Another young organizer underscores that democracy might have kind of favored people in their 50s. Democracy was sort of their dream come true in a way that's not necessarily the case for these younger people. And sort of as a result, these people who are maybe 50 and above, or sort of just generally like middle-aged and older, are the ones who might protest more for democratic institutions. And then in my protester survey, I asked respondents to check off the top 3 reasons that they decided to begin protesting against peace reforms. So we're given 12 potential responses, which ranged widely from a desire to protect democratic institutions, a desire to protect media freedom, individual rights and civil liberties. The top 6 responses are plotted here, but what's really surprising is that about 50% of all respondents noted that peace reforms reminding them of communism was one of the top 3 reasons that explain their decision to begin protesting against peace reforms. So together, these quotes, as well as many others that I do not have time to share, as well as these kind of preliminary survey findings, seem to suggest that for middle-aged and older individuals who were socialized under communist institutions, memories of communism and authoritarian rule may mobilize some subset of them to protest actively in defense of liberal democracy. I'm now obviously not saying that for every middle-aged or older poll, memories of communism will encourage them to protest. Indeed, work by Josh Tucker and Grigol Papaelikesh shows that people who lived through communism are less supportive of democracy in the aggregate. I'm also not dismissing the increasing activism of young polls. I'm simply arguing that for some subset of these middle-aged and older generations, memories of communism appear centrally important to them when they're describing why they decided to protest in defense of liberal democratic institutions, norms, and values. But why should we care about this finding that political socialization under non-democratic regimes can encourage people to defend democracy later in life? Well, I think that we should care about this finding for 2 reasons. So first, if we look at the activists that are most important in mobilizing people in defense of women's rights today in prominent groups like Women's Strike, we can see that many of these activists fall into the category that I've discussed. Many organizers in Warsaw and in general throughout the country at large fall into these middle-aged groups and older groups that did live through communism. And for those that I have interviewed and surveyed, they have articulated that their experiences living through communism and through the regime transition helps explain their protest participation today. Thus, I think that we cannot overlook the important role that political socialization during communist times seems to play in mobilizing protests in defense of liberal democratic norms, values, and institutions decades later. And then second, there appears to be some spillover in activism across issue areas. So individuals who initially protested largely with groups like CODE or ambivalences in support of liberal democratic institutions, kind of to defend constitutional courts and things like this, have across time supported materially and kind of helped to organize actions with groups like Strajk Kobiet. Indeed, Women's Strike was initially created as a splinter group off of CODE, and in many towns around Poland, activists march with and organize for both groups, as well as kind of a variety of other groups. And this might mean that we'll see more older people at protests in support of issues like women's rights to abortion, LGBTQ+ rights, and more. Moreover, given that there is a new generation that underwent political socialization as democratic institutions were being attacked and eroded, perhaps we'll see more of the younger generation becoming involved in protests to rally around liberal democratic institutions, partly resulting from their past participation in protests largely organized by these older cohorts. And arguably, the protests that we see today seem to suggest that. It seems to be the younger generation who had some political socialization during those large anti-peace protests of 2015 and 2016, be it against reforms to the judiciary that undercut judicial independence, or the initial attempts to curtail women's rights to abortion, who are really active in mobilizing and organizing to some degree in order to defend women's rights. Particularly in small towns, some protesters have underscored that had they not participated in the protests in Warsaw or other mid to large cities in Poland back in 2015 and 2016, protests that were once again largely organized by middle-aged and older activists, these younger citizens might not have had the courage to protest in their towns this year. As such, I think it's important to highlight the role of political socialization under moments of protest and to explore how that may shape the trajectory of protesters later in time. Research has shown that people who protest once or who are exposed to protesters in their social networks are more likely to protest in the future. So taking seriously who has protested in the past and how these moments of political socialization can shape who might protest in support of different issue areas in the future seems critical to understanding the protests in Poland ongoing today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Courtney. And our final speaker is Professor Milada Vahudova. Again, if you're going to share the screen, want to do it before you start speaking, just so we're sure that it's on.
Okay. Okay, can you see that, everybody?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start by saying, to first of all, thank you to my panelists who have already spoken, who have been brilliant, and thank you to our audience. And I'm just struck, especially listening to Konstantin Gebhardt about, we kind of thought that we were in a beautiful place in terms of democratization in the region. And I think we're learning the same lesson that we've learned here in the United States, that liberal democracy is something you have to keep fighting for. And Courtney has shown us, that Poles are fighting, and they're fighting for different reasons and different causes. But, I also had a glorious narrative of Poland in the 1990s. I was working for Václav Havel in Prague, the Czech president. And we would have these beautiful conferences once a year, and the Polish, Adam Michnik and Bronisław Geremek and others would come over, and I just thought, in Poland, everything is beautiful compared to the Czech Republic. Anyway, here we are. I'm speaking today about my article, Ethnopopulism and Democratic Backsliding. So if you have questions after my presentation, you're welcome to look it up. It is open access, so you can Google it. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and try to think about what the Law and Justice Party piece is in terms of comparative politics in Europe. And, many people are now talking about this literature on populism. And one of the things which troubles me is that we've started to use the word populism to label all, basically to mean far-right, anti-democratic, counter-majoritarian, anti-pluralist parties. But there's actually a variety of populism, different varieties. Populists do have some things in common. They all promise to defend the people against establishment elites. They argue that the elites are protecting their own privileges at the expense of ordinary citizens. But there are great differences in how they define the people and the establishment. And we do have populist parties on the left that have focused on sort of ordinary people who have suffered because of austerity, neoliberal economic policies, income inequality. And peace is not that. Although, as I'll talk about later, it incorporates some of those agenda items in order to buy votes. But left-wing populist parties tend to have an inclusive view of society. This distinction by Kasmuda and his co-author of an inclusionary versus an exclusionary populism is important. So if we look at Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain, they actually can help in terms of minority rights because they explicitly include migrants, refugees, and ethnic minorities in their conception of the people who deserve better representation. So we're talking about here populism on the cultural right. I call it ethnopopulism to distinguish it because it's broader than just the far right. And so here the people are cast as part of an ethnicity, a culture, a nation, religion, race, civilization. You can mix and match that is under threat. And what's important is that it's profoundly majoritarian. It derives its political legitimacy from the message that the majority of people support us. And majority means, if the majority supports it, that means that we have the right to enact it, and that there are very little protections for minorities. And it also justifies dismantling counter-majoritarian institutions that protect minority rights, whether that's religious or ethnic minorities or the LGBT community. And then who are the enemy? Well, the enemy and the left populists tend to be financial elites, Wall Street, think of Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. But here the enemies are culturally harmful outsiders. Now, as a strategy, how does ethnopopulism work, right? It's both a strategy to win votes and also critically to justify the concentration of power. And the panelists have already talked about this. Now, what I think makes ethnopopulism stand out from, say, the more traditional ethnic nationalism that we see in the region is this real kind of flexibility in terms of who are the people and who are the enemies. And unlike what has been true often historically in the region, the enemies don't tend to be so much neighboring states, although Poland still keeps Russia on the radar for that. The enemy tends to be this broad cultural and civilizational threat. And this has been actually a real innovation because this has allowed peace in Poland and Orban in Hungary, Salvini in Italy, the FPÖ in Austria. They're all can cooperate. Instead of seeing one another as enemies, they are all together, especially against things like the cosmopolitan world elite and the threat of Islam and Muslim refugees. Now here we get into some of the puzzles, right? So Professor Gebert already talked about this question of why does peace need this kind of vicious anti-Semitism as part of its narrative? You know, when we look at support for ethnopopulist parties, I think we all can sort of think of reasons why voters vote for them, right? And some of them have to do with changes over the last decades in terms of social and economic lived experiences. We have the debate in the United States about rural people, although not the poorest, but people who feel left behind, people who feel like they haven't gotten what they deserve. But we also see the uneven benefits of globalization and specifically European integration. If you're a cosmopolitan, urban, educated elite who likes to travel, you see the benefits of the European Union. But if you have a local life in a village somewhere in Europe, you are less likely to access those benefits. And then there's a large literature about the failure of representation of mainstream parties, how social democratic parties in particular sort of moved away from representing the interests of the working class. And this, a question to ask here is, what does peace actually deliver when in power? And it certainly has made an effort to deliver policies that will help sort of ordinary working people feel that they're getting a better deal from the government. And one of them, the most important, of course, is the payments to families for children. Now, the top-down reasons for support, I think, are what, often people will describe Orban in Hungary and even peace in Poland as sort of geniuses in a way, because they've managed to control the information environment and change public attitudes pretty dramatically on some issues. For example, the threat of Muslim refugees. Few people in the region had strong opinions, and now, the Czech Republic is the lowest in Europe, for example, in terms of tolerance for Muslims. So controlling the information environment, amplifying existing grievances and anxieties, and creating this sense of perpetual resentment. Now, our puzzles in East Central Europe are pretty amazing, right? We've already touched upon them. Like, why is this happening in Poland, also Hungary, and in a somewhat different form in the Czech Republic? These are among the most economically most successful in the region. Poland, the Czech Republic have done phenomenally well economically as EU members, and the gap between rich and poor is small. They have among the lowest inequality in Europe. But there are some reasons to think about, for example, the pace of change, right? That when things are moving so quickly, the economic changes, they bringing social changes, and this is threatening to people in terms of their identity and traditional values. You also have rising expectations that create resentments, especially when you look across the border to Western Europe. And you have relatively wealthy governments that can buy votes by doing things like having the ambitious family policies. Another puzzle, right, is why is this happening in the most ethnically homogenous countries? We would have expected that this kind of a narrative would have greater purchase than actually the countries where you have ethnic minorities. And this is a place where there's very little research. My colleague Jan Rovny at Sciences Po is writing articles and books to try to figure this out. And some of his hypotheses are that, for example, citizens in, say, Slovakia or Romania who have lived with ethnic minorities now, really existing ethnic minorities, not the threat of some Muslim refugee that's not on the ground, they know that it's not such a zero-sum game. They've went through similar tactics on the 1990s. And Jan Rovny also hypothesizes that the actual presence of an ethnic minority that's strong enough to have a large political party in the political system has a liberalizing effect in the medium term. So there's a lot of exciting research there. Other puzzles, you know, these were the most successful modes of transition, right? The Polish roundtable, the strong opposition to communism. And you actually see how today, the fact that that Poland was in the avant-garde, that Poland led the way out of communism through this incredible roundtable, has been used to spread this conspiracy theory, right? That it was all a stitch-up. And the fact that Adam Michnik and others explicitly said, you know, we have to include communists, we have to include everyone in this new Poland. We can't be looking back and trying to judge people's collaboration, but we need to all work together and move together, forward together. This now helps feed this conspiracy theory about the Polish roundtable. And then there's also the role of European integration. Again, a great success for Poland and for its neighbors. And you know, here I'm a little bit optimistic in the sense that Professor Gebhardt already mentioned the 85% of Poles support European Union membership. And yet many of those 85% are clearly voting for peace. And so I wonder if for them it's a kind of safety net, you know, they think, well, how far can peace really go? We're still in the EU. Or how far can the EU really go in telling us what to do? We have peace. So maybe that is working together. Across, you know, Americans who are watching this, who lived through the last 4 years of the American administration, will realize how incredibly resilient these ethno-populist parties are to hypocrisy, right? And in terms of peace in Poland, Holly Case and others have made this argument how ironic it is, right? That, you know, in the name of finally ridding Poland of communism, the peace regime is using many of the same methods that the communist regime used to control information, to censor, to repress, and to, as Professor Gebhardt mentioned, to kind of get people to self-censor themselves. And the other part that I find really ironic, right, is that they often claim that they're going to help the ordinary person, but their economic policies actually lead to rising income inequality. Now here, Poland does a little bit better than Hungary. You know, Hungary, Orban's payments to families, for example, have been what my colleague Dorothea Sikra calls welfare for the wealthy, in that the poorest Hungarian families are not even eligible. Whereas in Poland, these payments have actually reduced child poverty and inequality.
Camila, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm just gonna give you 2 more minutes to.
Okay, I'm on my last slide, so we're good. And so why are they so resilient? Hyper-partisanship, and also I already talked about the alternative media. And I just want to show you one slide that helps to end my presentation, and just to show you where peace and Fidesz are. This is data from the Chapel Hill Expert Survey, and here you see the salience of anti-establishment rhetoric, right? So these sort of a sign of a populist party, and you see peace and Fidesz. And over here, the salience of immigration. And so these parties really stand out. And if you look, for example, at Austria and Italy, it's not surprising to find the FPO in Austria and the Liga in Italy, similarly, you know, anti-establishment with immigration as one of their main appeals. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Milena, and thank you so much to all our panelists. We still do have about 20 some minutes, so if you can stick around, that'd be fantastic. I know some people have other things to do, like picking up kids or going to class or teaching, but we do have some time. So let me maybe just jump right in with questions, and there have been a number of them in the question and answer, and there's a few more in the chat. So I'll just go kind of in the order they were received. The first one comes to Courtney, and it's really about age and sort of the demographics. The question was, among Poles over 50, what % support peace as opposed to those who oppose it, and specifically the changes brought by peace as opposed to those who oppose it? So I think maybe we could just go one by one. So if you would like to entertain that question, that'd be great.
Yeah, so this is a great question. Unfortunately, I would assume that the answer would vary substantially by issue area. So something like lowering retirement age would probably be a lot more popular. But if we think about voting in the most recent election as kind of an aggregate measure of being supportive of these changes in general or opposed to them, it is true that people that are kind of middle-aged and older are more vote for peace at a higher rate. So in the recent election, people in their about 51% of people in their 50s voted for peace, and 55-ish% of people 60 and above. But what I think is also important to underscore is that even though rate support for peace and voting for peace is lower among the young people, for like 18 to 30-year-olds, it's about 26%. It's closer to 35% for 30 to 39-year-olds. Voting Confederacja is a lot more popular among young people than among the middle-aged and older cohorts. So if we think that there's some overlap there in terms of the types of policies that a voter for kind of the farther right Confederation Party would support, then the differences generationally are not as huge as we might expect. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Another question, it doesn't have an addressee, so I think it's up for the whole group, whoever wants to take it on. I'll just read it out. I find it fascinating that Poland, although exhibiting anti-European tendencies of burgeoning authoritarianism, still seems to favor EU membership. Is it purely an economic calculation for continued membership? And further, has the EU taken away or taken any action against Poland for the aforementioned censorship and anti-democratic attitudes, as EU membership specifically delineates protection of minority rights, right? So the two-part question, why is it just an economic thing? And what has the EU done, if anything, according to its charter, the Lisbon Treaty, etc., to sort of make Poland sort of accountable for its violations of the charter, right, or the principles laid out therein. I don't know who wants to take this one on. You're free to sort of respond as you like.
If I may, as Professor Dochodowa has mentioned, well, Poles treat the EU as a safeguard against peace, and peace as a safeguard against the EU. It's not only about economic benefit, although that benefit is blatantly obvious to anyone coming into the country. EU membership has profoundly transformed Poland economically. There is also the important fact that between 2 and 3 million Poles at a certain moment resided abroad, and they don't want, and Brexit was a tragedy in Warsaw. Nobody would like this to happen to Poles residing anywhere else in the EU. But it's more like a canny game of playing one against the other and trying to finagle through than anything more substantial. The EU actually has taken action on the issue of the government subversion of the independence of the judiciary. Poland has the dubious distinction of being the first country investigated under Article 7 of the European Union Treaty which mandates investigation of a member state in which the basic values of rule of law and democracy are threatened. Incidentally, we also belong to a very exclusive club, together with Russia, of the two countries whose safety is guaranteed by Hungary. Hungary has explicitly said it would not support sanctions against Poland or new sanctions against Russia. So far, we're safe. Thank you, Hungary.
I would just jump in and I agree completely. And I would just say that for me, the 85% support is a very positive thing, because the danger in Poland is that the same danger that we have here in the US of polarization, right? Where the two sides of the electorate have nothing in common. And Professor Gerber talked about how, if you're anti-EU, you're probably already all these other things as well. But here we see something where actually 85% of the electorate is supporting. And I, as a political scientist, looking at the next elections, I think, how can we peel off some of these peace voters, right? If some of them are voting just because of the money for the kids, and some of, that is something that could be peeled off. The other thing I would say about Hungary is the real danger of Hungary is that it wants to decouple the European Union from the regime type of liberal democracy. And if it succeeds in doing that, it will weaken the EU in myriad ways. And I feel like what happens next in Poland is critical to that, because if Poland re-elects peace yet again, then Hungary's project of separating the European Union from liberal democracy is more likely to be successful. It all depends on Poland.
Thanks so much. Oh, go ahead, please.
Just very briefly, I mean, it seems to me in the cases of Poland and Hungary, and perhaps also Croatia, that there's a very old sense of identity as being not just European, but in some ways hyper-European, better Europeans than the West Europeans. I think it would be almost inconceivable for Poles to imagine themselves outside of Europe in that sense. The EU would have to go very far in a secular direction or some other modern direction to alienate Poland in that regard. So the great wish of all the Poles that I met in the 1980s was to be part of a normal Europe. So it's I think difficult to imagine Poland outside of Europe, despite all the problems that some Poles may have with the EU.
Another thing that I'd like to underscore regarding the last part of that question is starting in about the summer of 2019, several towns declared themselves to be free of LGBTQ+ people. And since then, the EU has started to withdraw funding from some of these cities and towns. So I think one litmus test for kind of to what degree is this really an economic calculation could be, do we see political turnover in these localities?
Dr. Jonathan Larson, you had a question. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I'll just note in response to the question about the EU that there was an excellent presentation organized by U of I's Reese, co-sponsored by the EU Center a few weeks ago by Kim Lane-Sheppel at Princeton, talking about some of what has worked or not worked in the EU's approach to Poland and Hungary. And I imagine that something will be up about that event soon on website archives. But I had a question, and Courtney, you just touched on one gender, perhaps one part of the gender question here, and then of course also more recently the push to dramatically restrict abortion, like also very much an issue having to do with the politics of gender in Poland. And from some of the earlier comments, I was wondering if there might be something to comment on here. I was struck in particular by the comments about irony and hypocrisy, and a party such as Peace being perhaps relatively immune to irony and hypocrisy. And I was wondering if there isn't something about the kind of appeal of Peace or certain other populist parties, perhaps more of the right, but not exclusively, of the kind of rhetorical force of some of the political leaders. That there's something that in which they attempt to convey a deep sincerity that they truly care about protecting the interests of their country. And I certainly think that this has been part of the success of Donald Trump with his voter base, that for all of the apparent contradictions and flaws, that there's something going on with certain performance. And if this performance in a Polish context isn't also, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on if this performance isn't also to some degree most successfully done by certain male politicians as defenders of a Poland, and also with, and of course, done in part in relation using racialized others as a foil. And I'd be interested to hear your comments that might bring gender into the conversation a bit, but also thinking about gender in regards to race and the appeal of a party such as Peace.
Well, if I may,
Please.
this is a fundamentally important issue because, as Curtin rightly pointed out, young people support Confederacja. One of the reasons is it has a young leader. It's the only young face in Polish politics. But if you look at young people's support, it's young males who support Confederacja, while young women massively support the left, which is the only force that has consistently been defending women's rights and LGBT rights. Gender has become a political factor the way it never was before in Poland. And frankly, young males supporting Confederacja are hardly surprising. Confederacja wants to defend an order of male privilege they've been brought up in and they want to defend. So both young males and young women are absolutely consistent in their choices.
We seem to have, again, lost our transatlantic guest. I will ask another question that's been posted to the chat, a general question. What will be the impact on Poland of the rule of law requirements in the EU budget that's been recently approved? And I think there's somebody going to answer this question. So go ahead, please. I think.
I'm happy to say something about it. Listen, I think it has been quite a bit watered down. It is better than nothing. I think, the Peace government knows very well that the EU machinery works very slowly. So by the time the EU kind of catches up with kind of condemning something it has done in terms of concentrating power in the Polish judiciary, they will have already done it and moved on to the next thing. And so they've been very capable in terms of managing this kind of pressure from the EU so far. And while I think it does have an effect in terms of making them think twice about what they haven't done yet, it so far hasn't compelled them to roll anything back.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Constantin, we just kind of lost you for a second, and we've moved on to the next question. There's one more question. If I could follow up on the Konfederacja, the Janusz Korwin-Mikke party, right? Which I remember kind of always scaring me whenever I go back to Poland, because my cousin, who's got a PhD in postdocs and as an econometrist, really supports and supported, and not an econometrics person in Poland, he's in the UK. So he's an educated person, and some of these other people who support it are educated. And I'm wondering, was he like an outlier? Is the Confederacja party support, is there like a correlation with education? Are the young people who are supporting Confederacja likely to be more or less educated than the average, right? And we already established they're male, human identified. But what kind of, are they troubled by deep thought is my question, or not? Generally, if we could generalize, and I would defer to the experts on this.
Confederacja is a Rorschach test, okay? you project on it whatever your favorite gripe is. So you have the great unwashed voting confederatia, because they'll put everybody in their place. You have economic PhDs voting confederatia because they believe that a world without taxes will be much more successful, especially for them personally. But confederatia is only the tip of the iceberg. The neo-fascist and neo-Nazi extreme right has become a public presence, as was exemplified recently by a neo-Nazi being appointed director of the regional chapter in Wrocław of the Institute of National Remembrance, which is supposed to prosecute Nazi crimes. And he was removed after a massive outcry, very grudgingly. The gentleman, again, was not wishy-washy. He was photographed making the Nazi salute. He participated in the commemoration of the pogrom in the late 30s in Poland, commemorating the perpetrators, mind you, not the victims. And that was a person whom the state saw fit to entrust national memory to. The point is, Kaczynski cannot lose the extreme right, because if he loses it, he loses any hope for a majority again. So he needs to hug them close, and he'll hug them as close as they need to be hugged in order to remain within the camp.
I can just echo that this is very similar to Hungary, where Fidesz was competing with Jobbik, to the extent that Jobbik finally kind of gave up and tried to move to the center, and Fidesz has essentially destroyed that party, but in the process moved to the extreme right. The distance that Fidesz has traveled is pretty stunning. I think it's amazing we've made it this far without really talking about the Polish Catholic Church. This must be the first for a panel on Poland. And I would just say that it is the far right of the Polish Catholic Church that is vocal, that has political power now, and that speaks to people and interprets for them what traditional Polish values should mean. And so some of these young men, like your cousin, people react to what they're told by people in leadership positions. And so I think it's just like in our country, here in the US, you often have the most extreme voices are the loudest in terms of defining what it means to be a traditional Pole. And unfortunately, that has become a misogynist, has a misogynist interpretation, right? Where you need to put women in their place. We see that in the United States as well, this kind of rise in males who think that their existence is under threat in a kind of existential way, turning to the far right.
Yeah, I saw a headline in yesterday's Gazeta Wyborcza, just Gazeta PL actually, about a priest who's rebuking, a parish priest who's rebuking his female congregants for daring or having the conceit to think that they're equal of men, right? So yeah, if you're reading any Polish news, it will be sort of mentioned. And I'm following closely the case of Klementyna Suchanov, who's my authority on Gombrowicz, having written this brilliant, well, it's in my house, not my office, Ja Geniusz, right? This wonderful biography of Gombrowicz, but now she has more important things to do, for example, getting herself unarrested, right, for being a activist during the most recent abortion law debacle. So I don't want to say, I mean, I'm glad that we actually skipped the church for once, right? But if we were to put a number to it, is it like mainly from the church, would you say, or is the church opportunistically, or parts of it, are they opportunistically sort of using power politics, knowing that they will at least have a captive audience every Sunday? And I'm not sure where it originates from, though, right? That would be a question to sort of get an answer on.
Well, I was hoping John would address that, but there's just one vital statistic that needs to be thrown in. In the over 35 years age group, weekly participation in Holy Mass is at 40%. In the under 35, at 20%. The church has made a political choice And one of the consequences of that choice is it has completely lost the youth. So if we will still have democratic politics in Poland, the church essentially has voted itself out of office of moral authority. And there's a lot of cold cash to be lost when you lose that office. The church is fighting back and fighting dirty. But without the support of the state, it will fail. And the state still believes that the support of the church guarantees the ruling party a stranglehold on Polish opinion. And I think they're both very mistaken. But John, I'd be very curious to know what you think.
Well, I've been viewing events from California for the last 4 years, and not being on Polish soil is a distinct disadvantage. But the news that one gets from California is not promising regarding the church. I hear a lot from my friend Staszek Obirek, and it's purely negative. There are no points of light. I mean, there's this Znak group in Kraków, which is relatively liberal, but beyond that, I think that the hierarchy strikes me as being on a road to an Ireland, kind of an Ireland situation or a Spain situation, where they work themselves, as you were suggesting, into a position of relative obscurity and irrelevance. So I don't know. I mean, it's amazing how it's not a democratic institution. And so it's amazing how it can be in some ways insensitive to pressures from the flock. You see this in the United States as well, by the way. I mean, the current group ahead of the bishops' conference, mostly appointed by a well-known Polish figure, themselves are it seems to me out of touch with the perceptions and the needs of the flock. So I don't know. I try to, when I look at European politics, to find signs of hope, and the Polish church is not one of them. There simply doesn't seem to be any force for rejuvenation in that institution. So I envision a kind of Ireland situation. My daughter and I were in Ireland in the spring of last year. It was extraordinary. We were about the only people going. We were in the cathedral in Belfast. I think we were the only people under the age 60. Amazing, actually, to see that in Ireland. So perhaps that's the future of Poland.
And you can't, the irony, right, of the Pope being too liberal for the Polish Catholic Church. It reminds me of when I took a train from Moscow to Prague in 1987, and they stopped me and they took every single piece of literature that I had written in Russian, because at that point the Soviet Union was too liberal for communist Czechoslovakia. The writing was on the wall there.
Absolutely. So I think we have come to the end of a fantastically informative and just making my synapses pop in new ways panel. I'd like to thank all the panelists for coming, and coming figuratively, but onto the Zoom.